from time to time. We'll now go to resuming debate, and the honourable member for Calgary Rocky Ridge.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise in the chamber and to take part in one of the most basic responsibilities of Parliament, which is to discuss the authority of the Crown's government to spend its citizens' money. And it's been a long time, over 2 years. The last budget was 7 months before the last election, which seems like a lifetime ago. It's easy to forget that in the third quarter of 2019, the Canadian economy was then teetering on the brink of recession. The economy had stopped growing in the fourth quarter of 2019, and the first quarter of 2020 was grim, even without the pandemic. Canada's debt to GDP ratio was rising, our AAA credit rating had been cut, and the government had already racked up $100 billion in new debt during a booming global economy. All of that before COVID. And we were then expecting Bill Morneau's deficit targets would be significantly blown in the 2020 budget. But then the pandemic was declared, and the budget was cancelled, and we had to wait 13 more months for this budget. There was no question that the government then had to support those who had been ordered or even recommended not to work. Businesses that were being asked or told to close needed to be supported. Massive emergency spending was necessary public policy at the time, from the moment that public health orders took away people's paychecks and business revenues. Yet, that is not an excuse for refusing to table a budget, and it doesn't forgive the lack of fiscal discipline and lack of financial stewardship in this budget. The borrowing contained in this budget staggers the imagination, another $330 billion over the next 5 years on top of the $355 billion in last year alone. And there's no end in sight. Merely a hope that this will mean eventually a return to a declining debt to GDP ratio starting next year. This anchors one that has already been discarded before COVID and has no credibility coming from this government in this budget. And Mr. Speaker, I do want to mention I had intended to split my time with the member for Richmond-Steveston, so I hope that's all right now to bring to your attention. Anyway, we hear that this government say over and over again, both before COVID and during, that deficits are all right because interest rates are so low. But Canada's accumulated debt, the majority of which is not locked in long term, is extraordinarily vulnerable to interest rate volatility. And to this, the government also responds that, well, they expect interest rates to stay low for the foreseeable future, so really there's nothing to worry about until there's economic recovery. But therein lies the threat to the sustainability of Canada's public finances. The sustainability of this unprecedented debt is jeopardized if interest rates rise. And yet economic recovery is precisely what will trigger interest rates to rise. And having to service such high debt at higher rates will threaten the economy all over again and eventually necessitate higher taxes or cuts to services that Canadians depend on. So this budget is claimed to contain over $105 billion to stimulate and ensure $105 billion in stimulus to ensure economic recovery. But that's not true, Mr. Speaker. The single largest line item in the $105 billion of stimulus is actually emergency support funds for this year's continuing payments alone. In other words, more than a quarter of the so-called stimulus is really just emergency response spending because this government couldn't get its act together to protect Canadians from the third wave. And Mr. Speaker, that's perhaps the biggest criticism I have about this budget. The budget doesn't contain what Conservatives have been asking for since last May, that the government have a plan rooted in data and measurable data to have a safe and permanently reopened economy. The very reason that this budget contains tens of billions of dollars in continued emergency COVID spending is that the government has failed to use the tools that already exist to help Canadians live safely in a COVID-19 world. When the economy first shut down during the first wave, there was no other sensible option based on the information available to policymakers in March of 2020. But since then, the government has failed to procure vaccines in time. They've failed to procure and approve and ensure the wide distribution of rapid at-home test kits approved for screening purposes. The only meaningful and timely response this government has had to COVID is to spend while hoping that things will get better. Now, there's no question that the government's vaccine procurement is a disaster. Canada is taking surplus vaccines from other countries and raiding the COVAX system for developing nations. This because even their terribly slow delivery schedule from the manufacturers aren't coming through. The inadequate health response is what's driving the dangerous levels of debt contained in this budget. And the absence of a plan that would have avoided the ravages of a third wave threatened to destroy thousands more small businesses. And Mr. Speaker, I've said it before in this House many times, small businesses are the lifeblood of our communities. They're the backbone of the Canadian economy. The owners, the workers, and the customers, they're our neighbors, they're our friends. And these small businesses are the ones that have borne the brunt of COVID. Yet this budget contains, yes, it contains extensions to the supports that many small businesses need just to survive through the summer. But that's not what small businesses want. They want their customers back. They want to be open. They want to serve the needs of their communities. They want to give their own friends and neighbors their jobs back. And they want to at least try to put the hopes and dreams of their business back together that were shattered by COVID. They don't want to take on more debt, Mr. Speaker. The average small business has already taken on $170,000 in debt since the pandemic began, and these debts threaten their recovery. Some of this debt is in the form of low or no interest loans from government aid programs, but the majority of this debt actually comes in the form of bills that small businesses just can't pay, like their rent or their suppliers' invoices. These debts threaten to cascade throughout the economy and prevent recovery. By the end of last year, 60,000 small businesses had failed and nearly 200,000 more are hanging by a thread. But there is one particular group of small businesses that have been completely, and one must even conclude at this point, deliberately ignored by this government, and that is small businesses that had the terrible misfortune to have opened their doors in late 2019 or early 2020. In most cases, the owners of these businesses have put their life savings into a business and incurred significant debt to pursue a dream and open and start or reinvent a small business. But these businesses have nothing, and there's nothing in this budget that will help them. The Minister of Small Business and her Parliamentary Secretary have been saying for months that new businesses will be supported, but they have done nothing. This once in 2 years budget still ignores these businesses. Just this weekend, Mr. Speaker, I got an email from the owner of a business who opened an auto service business in Calgary in October 2019, and this business can't even acquire a CEBA loan, which is among the simplest ones and the easiest ones to qualify for, and this business is unable to get even a CEBA loan, never mind the access to the other aid measures. So this small business is not going to be sustained by words. They need cash, or better still, their customers from a fully open economy and a vaccinated population. Between platitudes like, we've got your back, and we'll stop at nothing, and we will continue to work for new programs for new businesses, the government will occasionally mention that it's concerned about integrity of its programs and making sure that businesses don't suddenly materialize to take advantage of their programs. But of course, Mr. Speaker, nobody wants small businesses, nobody wants anyone to game the system. But Mr. Speaker, with all the red tape in this country, it takes months to even get a building permit to start a new restaurant. Somebody that opened in March of 2020 was spending their own money, exhausting their finances long before COVID began, and they are left out of programs. There are thousands of these businesses. They're in every riding. I know every MP in this House gets emails from these kinds of businesses. And there's so much more I could say, Mr. Speaker. I see that my time is running out, but I have to end by pointing out that there are many necessary economic support measures contained in this budget, but they are necessary precisely because this government has failed so spectacularly to protect Canadians from the third wave. And it would be imprudent to support a government that adds so much debt without a coherent plan to manage this debt and reduce it over time. There's just no fiscal anchor or even any credibility with this government around its fiscal anchors. So with that, Mr. Speaker, thank you, and I will look forward to the questions.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
The member started his speech, Mr. Speaker, by talking about the government's desire to take on debt right now because of low interest rates. Well, that's not entirely true. The reason why governments are okay with taking on and having deficits is because as long as they're growing their economy at a pace that outpaces that debt, it's realistic to take it on. Don't take my word for it. Ask Brian Mulroney or Stephen Harper. Out of the 16 years that they were in government, they ran deficits 14 of the 16 years. And as a matter of fact, the Conservatives' own plan says that it'll take them 10 years to get back to balanced budgets. This is the current Conservative Party. The current leader is saying he will run deficits for 10 years. The spending, the member is absolutely correct. It's all happening right now because it's to help Canadians get through this. So therefore, on the other end of this, as soon as it's over, the deficits are going to drop considerably. Why do they need 10 years to bring it back to a balanced budget then, Mr. Speaker?
For Calgary Rocky Ridge.
I don't even know where to start with that, Mr. Speaker. Has this member even looked at the chart that shows their deficit projections? This government will never balance a budget. There is no plan anywhere to come even close to it. Their plan that's contained in this budget hopes that they might dip below 50% debt to GDP by the end of its projections. And that's if nothing goes wrong between now and 2026. This is a government that promised, has broken through every fiscal anchor that it came up with, right from the promises it made in 2015. The debt to GDP ratio was rising even before COVID. There is no credibility from this government on any fiscal anchor or any attempt to address, to have a long-term plan.
Question and comment.
Questions and comments.
The honourable member for Nanaimo, Ladysmith.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the honourable member for his speech and focusing on government priorities and spending. And I would just like to ask him what he thinks about wasting $18 billion on the Trans Mountain expansion project and another $18 billion in subsidies to the fossil fuel industry when we are in a climate crisis and we know that we need to transition. Does he think that money would be better spent on that transition to a clean energy economy?
Honourable member for Calgary Rocky Ridge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I agree that the fact that the government of Canada had to buy the Trans Mountain pipeline to get it built is a spectacular failure of policy on the part of the federal government. The federal government chased out a private builder that was going to build the pipeline with private money. They chased the project builder out of the country and are using public money to build. I agree, that's a failure of the federal government. That pipeline should have been built privately and be up and running, getting our products to market, generating revenue that we could then use to fund programs that are important to Canadians.
I have time for one more short question. The honourable member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my friend from Calgary, Rocky Ridge, for his very accurate speech of this complete failure on the part of this government in so many different areas in terms of its budget. One area that our province of Alberta has been hit particularly hard by is this government's anti-energy policies over the last 6 years. In the budget, there was almost no mention of the oil and gas sector. Can my friend speak to that?
The honourable member for Calgary Rocky Ridge.
Yeah, it's incredibly disappointing that in 730 pages of a budget, they couldn't even discuss really an industry that contributes so much to Confederation. It's as if this government just thinks that the primary industries and export industries that fund services in Canada are not important enough for a substantial mention in a 730-page budget document. Very disappointing to, yes, indeed, my own constituents, so many of whom have struggled with unemployment since this government came to office in 2015.